If you haven't heard already, I released a second Actualized channel called Actualized Clips with short snippets of my long videos. Make sure you go check that out, subscribe if you'd like those. Link down below. All right, now let's get to the main topic of understanding and coping with nihilism. So here we're going to tackle really two strands of this problem. First of all, just what is nihilism, understanding it culturally, historically, where it came from, its meaning. And then we're going to be taking a look at what nihilism gets correct about reality, what it gets incorrect. It's a mixed bag. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding that we're going to address here today. And then at the very end, you want to make sure you stay for the end, because at the end, after we cover what nihilism is and some of its mistakes and proper understandings, I'm going to talk about how to actually cope with it. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how to deal with that spiral dynamic stage green relativism, which leads to a sense of meaninglessness in life, and how I coped with it in my youth. And I'll share some pointers, very practical pointers, for how you can cope with it yourself and then get beyond it. All right. So this is not just empty philosophy here. There's going to be practical implications for all this stuff, as always, with everything I talk about. So what is nihilism? Well, nihilism is a very much misunderstood word in our culture. It's often used pejoratively in a negative way to demonize or dismiss some set of ideas or beliefs. And that's a problem, because there's something deeply true about nihilism, which we're going to explain, but also there's problems with nihilism. So it's not so simple. It's not so black and white. It's a gray area. Even most professional philosophers don't really understand the implications of nihilism. It's treated too much as just some sort of historical artifact. And no serious philosopher tells you how to actually apply it in your life and what you should do with it, and also what the mistakes of it are. So today we're going to clear this whole thing up. All right, so the common meaning of nihilism, there's sort of like two parts to the meaning. There's like a common meaning, and then there's a technical definition you might get from a philosophy professor. We're going to be going over both of those. But the common meaning of the word, the way it's used colloquially in our culture, is to mean something like godlessness or meaninglessness or pointlessness to life, the rejection of morality, depression, disillusionment, negativity, pessimism, anarchy, cynicism, skepticism, belief in nothing, atheism, indifference, destruction, isolation, feeling lost, even perhaps misanthropy and despair. Now, a lot of negative aspects to that. And that's actually one of the problems that our culture has with the word nihilism, is that they tend to use it very pejoratively and negatively, and we'll be looking at why that is. There's some very deep psychological reasons for that. Here are some dictionary definitions of nihilism to get us started in the right direction. The first definition I found is the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. A second one is extreme skepticism, maintaining that nothing in the world has a real existence. A third one is a worldview that traditional values and beliefs are unfounded and that existence is senseless and useless. And a fourth one is a doctrine that denies any objective ground of truth and especially of moral truths. So that gets you a pretty good sense of it, but I also want to read some detailed descriptions of it from Wikipedia and from certain online encyclopedia sources, because in researching this topic, I really liked what they had to say, and it's going to set the foundation for everything we talk about. And it'll show us some of the limitations of these definitions, because even when you go to Wikipedia or to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or whatever, and you read through their descriptions of nihilism, they're going to give you more of like a historical account. And then it'll leave you scratching your head as to like, well, is it true? Which parts of it are true? Which are false? How do you fit it in with personal development work? How do you actually make it useful and practical? What are its limitations and strengths? And what is it missing, perhaps? All right, so Wikipedia says the following, quote, nihilism, from the Latin nihil, or nothing, is a philosophy or family of views within philosophy, expressing negation towards general aspects of life that are widely accepted within humanity as objectively real, such as knowledge, existence, and the meaning of life. Different nihilist positions hold variously that human values are baseless, that life is meaningless, that knowledge is impossible, or that some set of entities do not exist. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche used the term to describe the Western world's disintegration of traditional morality. End quote. Quote, for Nietzsche, there is no objective order or structure in the world except what we give it. Penetrating the facades buttressing convictions, the nihilist discovers that all values are baseless and that reason is impotent. Every belief, every considering something true, Nietzsche writes, is necessarily false because there is simply no true world. For him, nihilism requires a radical repudiation of all imposed values and meaning. Nihilism is not only the belief that everything deserves to perish, but one actually puts one's shoulder to the plow one destroys. End quote. And that's from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So Nietzsche's work is associated with nihilism quite a bit. Although really to call Nietzsche himself a nihilist would be a problem because Nietzsche's philosophy was a little bit more complex than simply that. It wasn't about destroying all values and then leaving it at that. Really for him, it was about clearing away all of the falsely constructed narratives and religious systems and so on from the past 2,000 years, recognizing their limitations and their artificiality, destroying those, but then what that leaves is a clearing on top of which one can build an authentic life and become what he would call a supermensch, sort of like the Uberman, the Superman. And then you're not living simply by somebody else's social conditioning. You're living by your own values. So it's not that Nietzsche didn't really believe in values, and he wasn't properly a nihilist. He just believed in nihilism as a means to an end towards actually authenticity and some sort of higher values that come after that, which are not socially conditioned. So be careful about that. It's easy to forget that additional, last step. And really, in that sense, clearing out social conditioning, that's a very good thing. Unless, of course, you're very attached to your social conditioning, like if you have a traditional religious orientation, then that might be a problem for you because you're attached to it and you don't want that cleared away. And you might be kind of shocked at well, why would you want to clear away all social conditioning? Well, one of the things you discover as you get deep into personal development work and self-actualization is that a lot of the social conditioning and values and norms and morality and religion that you received from your society has problems to it. And these problems have played themselves out for thousands of years, have led to lots of violence and hatred and judgment and death and inequality and all sorts of things like this. And also, how can you just know that they're true for yourself? If you haven't derived them from first principles, then maybe they're false. Maybe they're illusions. Maybe they're constructions. See? Now, this last part of this quote that I read you, where he says that nihilism is sort of the belief that everything deserves to perish and you should not just kind of hope for it to perish, but you should even push it, like to break things down, to destroy. This is a problematic rendition of nihilism, I would suggest. Because after all, here's the problem, is that if everything is truly meaningless, if you really believe that everything is truly meaningless, then why would you want to destroy it? You see, that's an additional extra step the mind has to take. And in fact, to actively destroy something, or even to actively dislike something or to hate it, that is already to attach a negative meaning to it. That's one of the problems with nihilism, depending on how you construe nihilism. Because if you construe nihilism as literally just complete meaninglessness to reality. Okay, but then if you go one step further and you say, and because of that, I have to destroy society and institutions and things, that's a secondary step that I'm not willing to take with you. And I'll show you why that's problematic. That is problematic. But before we get into that, let's continue forward here because we have some more to read. Continuing from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it says, quote, "The caustic strength of nihilism is absolute," Nietzsche argues, "and under its withering scrutiny, the highest values devalue themselves. The aim is lacking, and why finds no answer. Inevitably, nihilism will expose all cherished beliefs and sacrosanct truths as symptoms of a defective Western mythos. This collapse of meaning, relevance, and purpose will be the most destructive force in history, constituting a total assault on reality and nothing less than the greatest crisis for humanity." End quote. So Nietzsche was writing in the late 1800s, and this was right at the turn of the century, before World War I and World War II. And so what was happening in the Western civilized world at that time is that all of the old-fashioned Christian values, Judeo-Christian values in that worldview was starting to unravel. It was unraveling from the philosophical perspective, but it was starting to also unravel from the scientific perspective because science was becoming more and more advanced. And materialism, we're really talking about the birth of materialism, scientific materialism here, of atheism, stuff like that. It really started with you might say, with Nietzsche, and then flowered very, very seriously in the next 50 years after that. And then we're living with the fallout from that. And so, of course, one of the questions back then was like, well, what happens if we lose all our Judeo-Christian values and worldview? What happens if we, as a society, stop believing in God for the most part, or at least act like God is not important, or that God is just some sort of superstitious fairy tale from the past, from our ancestors, and we have sort of transcended that with our logic and our rationality and our science? What happens in this kind of society? And then some people claimed, well, it would unravel society and lead to war and to disaster and to all sorts of monstrosities. And perhaps to a certain extent, that is what happened with World War I and World War II. Of course, there are many more causes to World War I and World War II than just this, but you could say that this is sort of like the backdrop against which World War I and World War II occurred, and all the stuff that, the atrocities and other problems that occurred in between those two wars. Moving on here, says, quote, "Nihilism is the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. It is often associated with extreme pessimism and a radical skepticism that condemns existence. A true nihilist would believe nothing, have no loyalties, and no purpose other than, perhaps, an impulse to destroy. In the 20th century, nihilistic themes like epistemological failure, value destruction, and cosmic purposelessness have preoccupied artists, social critics, and philosophers." End quote. So what happened basically within philosophy, and also in a certain sense within science as well, just historically, in the context of Western intellectual tradition, is that many of the axioms and assumptions and frameworks that existed for hundreds and thousands of years that went unquestioned started to be questioned philosophically. Language started to be questioned. Our notions of how language shapes reality. Euclidean geometry was questioned. Even absolute space and time was questioned by Einstein and by quantum physicists. The idea of even there being matter out of which this universe is made started to be questioned. And so as this was happening and everything was being questioned on all these fronts, also in logic, in mathematics, there started to be questions about the nature of what mathematics is, whether mathematics is even logical. There were attempts to formalize mathematics that failed disastrously and conclusively. There were failures within logical positivism within the sciences. That failed. So mankind's attempts at the turn of the century, at the early 1900s, mankind was basically getting to the point where we were getting pretty cocky. We were thinking like, okay, I think we got this thing figured out. We've got the world figured out. We basically got physics figured out. We've got chemistry almost figured out. We've got biology pretty much figured out. We've figured out evolution now with Darwin's discoveries. So we kind of know where man came from. We know it wasn't from God. So the story goes. And we've got logic figured out. You know, in the next few decades, we're going to have all of logic locked down. We're going to have all of mathematics locked down. And then basically there's even quotes of famous scientists saying something like, we figured out 98% of everything, and the other 2% we're going to figure out in the next 50 or 100 years. And then there's not going to be any more like even point to doing physics. We'll have it all figured out. And once we have physics figured out, since we're just living in this clockwork universe and everything is perfectly deterministic, well then we'll have everything figured out because everything just boils down to physics in this sort of reductionistic sense. And then also on the cultural front, things were being questioned, like art. Molds were being broken within art, with the Impressionist movements in Europe, and then with Picasso, you know, he was breaking the mold in terms of what art means. And then abstract Impressionism came after that, and then other sorts of weird art movements that completely broke the old classical and neoclassical traditions, and they broke with realism. And then, of course, social norms and things were being questioned as well, with the rise of feminism, early feminism. The patriarchy was being questioned. So all the sort of like the old structures of the Judeo-Christian world were being questioned. But then what happened within logic, for example, is that attempt to formalize all of logic by people like Gottlob Frege and Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell and others, those were shattered by Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which I have an episode upon, where I discuss its metaphysical and epistemic implications. And so that crashed that endeavor. You can't formalize logic. You can't formalize mathematics. There's actually an infinite number of different kinds of logics. And also with physics, we've discovered that we know a lot less about physics than we really do. And so basically what it sort of opened us up to is this, where before we were very well buttoned down as a society and we thought we had it figured out. Really, what we discovered is that, no, we were fooling ourselves. We put a bunch of blinders up and we made all these constructions where we thought we understood more than we really do. And now we realize how little we really understand in terms of language, logic, mathematics, science, physics. And this kind of opens us up into this unknown chaos, which can feel nihilistic. And our sense of meaning and value is getting eroded as well because we're losing our faith in God. We're starting to question gender identity and roles. We're starting to question monarchies and other sorts of political systems. And then where does that leave us? As individuals and as a society, where should society be headed? How do we get all of these individuals to agree upon some direction for society in this new directionless, nihilistic world? Wikipedia also says, quote, the term was also a pejorative for certain value-destructive trends of modernity, namely the negation of Christianity and European tradition in general. It was also in use during the Middle Ages to denote certain forms of heresy, end quote. And then from the encyclopediabritannica.com, it says, quote, nihilism represented a crude form of positivism and materialism, a revolt against the established order. It negated all authority exercised by the state, by the church, and by the family. It based its belief on nothing but scientific truth. Science would be the solution to all social problems. All evils, nihilists believed, derived from a single source, ignorance, which science alone would overcome, end quote. So there's actually something very sneaky here going on in this particular formulation of nihilism. Again, see here that what nihilism purports to be and how it actually behaves in the world can be two different things which can be actually contradictory with each other. So, for example, if you truly wanted to deconstruct everything, as a nihilist supposedly does, if you wanted to destroy everything, well then how could you say that then science will be what remains? Why didn't you also destroy science? Why would you rely on science to replace religion or good old-fashioned family values? You see? And if what you're concerned about is ignorance, and you say that all of evil stems from ignorance, okay, I would agree with you. But then what about science? How can you say that science will allow you to overcome that ignorance? Isn't science part of that ignorance? You see, so there's a question for nihilists as far as how deep are you really willing to go with your nihilism? There can be surface level formulations of it, and there can be deeper level formulations of it. And so I think this just varies upon how deep of a nihilist you are. And what I see is that most people aren't really willing to go deep into nihilism. And the reason that is for very good reason, because it's not very useful to your survival to be a nihilist. How do you live in the world as a nihilist? And this is, I think, what most ordinary people would say about nihilism. And they would say something like, well, Leo, yeah, sure. I mean, this is all nice philosophy and theory and stuff. But in the real world, if you have children, you got to go to work and feed them. So who gives a shit about this stupid nihilistic philosophy? It doesn't get us anywhere. And, it doesn't help me grow my business, doesn't help me earn more money, doesn't help me get sex. So what's the point? How is it useful? It seems antithetical to usefulness. And of course, yeah, nihilism is not useful. Or maybe it is, because maybe there are things in the world that need to be destroyed. Structures, belief systems, social conditioning, social norms. Maybe these are holding us back. And then destroying those might be useful. Maybe it might be useful to clear your mind of all social conditioning and all value systems. Maybe. Is it? Well, it depends on how you do it. So what we really had going here is we had a deep spiral dynamic stage blue. And if you don't know what that is, go watch my spiral dynamic series starting with stage blue. We had spiral dynamic stage blue, then Nietzsche came along and he was sort of at the forefront of stage orange, which we would say is modernity. So Christianity gave rise, after Christianity exhausted itself, and it became untenable, after enough scientific discoveries, after Darwin, after evolution, after Einstein, after quantum mechanics, after all these sorts of things, after electricity and so on, Christianity basically became untenable for serious intellectuals, which led to a sort of nihilism. But then that nihilism very quickly was replaced with scientific materialism and the sort of mechanistic, pragmatic approach, which is stage orange. And this was both good and bad. It was good in the sense that we shed a lot of superstition, dogma, theocracy, and very narrow ethnocentric thinking from the past. We put an end to holy wars and religious domination of others. We got rid of this idea that Christianity is the one true worldview and that all other ones are heathen and need to be converted either by sword or by evangelical proselytization. That's a mouthful. So we got over that, then came a sort of a period of brief nihilism, but that nihilism, that void, the problem is that nature abhors a vacuum, as they say, and that void quickly gets filled up with the worldview of scientific materialism. To the point where today, people born today into the scientific materialist worldview, they can't even imagine that there used to be previous worldviews, that our ancestors and scientists and intellectuals of the past, for example, had idealist worldviews rather than materialist ones, or Christian worldviews. And they took those worldviews just as seriously as you take your materialism. So And then with materialism came sort of a pragmatic approach to reality. Like if there's no higher order values, if there is no God and anything is allowed, basically, and we're living in a sort of a moral relativistic landscape, then what is life about then? Life is not about worshiping or going to church or working towards some beautiful afterlife or heaven or working to avoid the eternal damnation of hell, which is what life was for people for thousands of years. In Europe, for example. Now life is just about what? It's about material acquisition. It's just about carnal pleasure, personal comfort, success, as much money and sex as I can get, the business that I can build, the science that I can do, and just being practical and normal, having fun. It becomes about that. And that seems like, well, that's a much better way to live. Well, in a certain way it is, in a certain sense. But in another certain sense, it's a very hollow existence. And this is where someone like Jordan Peterson would come in and say, if you take that too far, your life just becomes about work and money, and you lose touch of something higher than you. You lose the spiritual component. And then, in a sense, that is this sort of nihilism or this lack of direction in your life. And then because of that, society becomes dysfunctional. You as an individual become dysfunctional. Because there's actually something deeply important that was there in the old traditions that is missing from this purely pragmatic, materialistic way of living. So we need to go back to the old myths and stories and extract the wisdom and lessons of our ancestors. And then, of course, after stage orange, like in the 1950s and 60s, then came stage green, came online. And green was even more relativistic. And it not only was it, so far we've been talking about modernity, but then it went even beyond that into postmodernity. And then there was a lot of very deep questioning of all morals and even cultural norms. Like, what does it even mean to be a man or a woman? Even that started to be questioned. Is heterosexuality even correct? Even that became questioned. And basically with stage green, the relativistic stage, all the remaining foundations of Western civilization were undermined. There was a loss of this sort of simplistic top-down authority, not just of religion, which already happened with modernity, but now even with science. So see, a lot of what sort of normies don't like about postmodernism is that postmodernism doesn't just question the old traditions of the ancestors. It goes a step further. It questions modernity, the idea of an objective reality, the idea that physics is the one true interpretation and explanation for what reality is. Postmodernity questions that. And a lot of folks in the hard sciences don't like this because they like the authority they have of the hard sciences. They want to say, no. Yeah, this postmodernism stuff, this is just from the soft sciences. These people, they're just kind of philosophers and social critics. But what they're talking about, this relativism, sure, maybe there's a relativism of different cultures, of morals and norms. A hard scientist would acknowledge that. And maybe, Western civilization is not the best civilization. Maybe there's value in Eastern civilization, in the Middle Eastern civilization, and all this. Okay, we'll admit that. But let's protect the foundation of science, the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, and logic. These cannot be questioned because these are the deepest source of truth in our society. They produce all of our technology. Look, we landed a man on the moon. Look at the satellites we launch. Look at the rockets we have. Look at the nuclear weapons we have. You can't deny that that is real. It's tangible. You can't just say that's relative. And so biology truly does say that there's a man and there's a woman, and this is based on DNA evidence. And a postmodernist would say, no, even that is just a limited and biased way of looking at the world. And it is not the absolute truth, and it is not the most important and the most objective. And so postmodernists, for example, would level critiques even at the hard sciences by saying stuff like, well, most of the hard sciences have been done by privileged white men for centuries, for millennia. And that presents a very certain biased view of the physical world. For example, when women do science, they might have a different way of looking at the world. They might have a different epistemology, a different metaphysics, a different emphasis on what's important to look at. Because it's not just that you're looking at the physical world as it is. Really what you're doing is you're cherry picking data and facts. You're running certain kinds of experiments, but then it's you who's determining what kind of experiments are worthwhile to run and how to interpret the data and how to frame the data and what it means. And then how to decide what kind of society to structure based upon that data. What kind of normative rules and guidelines to give to people in a society. Now, of course, the hard scientists, they're at stage orange, they're stuck in stage orange, and so they will debate that. And so now we have a debate between orange and green. And I'm not going to go too deeply into that here because you can debate that for hours. There's valid points to be made on both sides. But in general, stage green is above stage orange. And if you move to green properly in a solid way, and you also integrate orange as you move to green, then you should still be able to retain the truths of orange, the partial truths of orange, and then transcend them with green. But with green comes a sort of what Ken Wilber calls an aperspectival madness. Basically, when you move into green, the reason people are scared of moving into green, the reason there's so much backlash against green, is because green is actually very difficult on you psychologically. And I went through this when I was in my late teens, early 20s. Really more like late teens. I went through it pretty early, where I realized that all of the moral systems were just constructions and were social conditioning and programming. Whether Christian and even science, I started to question even science, the norms of science, the method of science. And I started just to see that all of these are just different and very limited and partial ways of interacting with reality and looking at reality, and that they're not absolutely true. And when that happened, I was left in this sort of what I would describe like in the middle of the ocean, rudderless, not knowing which direction to go, because I had all these different perspectives and I couldn't determine which one was right. Because for me, I became sort of a complete relativist, and it was like, well, terrorists are bombing 9/11. Is that good or bad? Well, who's to say? I mean, after all, as an American, I have biases. Of course, I don't like it as an American, but if I was lived in the Middle East and I was an oppressed, Muslim, maybe that would be a good thing for me. And after all, American capitalism has done a lot of bad stuff in the Middle East. So who's to say they don't even have a valid point? That's one perspective you might take as a relativist. Another perspective you might take is like, well, like on war. Is the war in Iraq a good thing or a bad thing? And you can make sort of a case for both. And so basically, or like another example would be like with the left wing and the right wing. At that point in my life, when I was in my late teens, I would watch basically both sides of the political aisle, the left and the right, and I would treat them totally equally. Because at that point, I didn't have enough discernment to understand. I didn't know about spiral dynamics. I didn't know that there were sort of lower and higher stages of development. And so I thought that everybody was just equal and that the left and the right were just two equal sides of the coin. And so I watched a lot of conservative media, even though I didn't agree with it, because I myself was quite liberal. But like I would watch a lot of Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity. I would listen to a lot of right-wing talk radio for hours and hours and hours. And even though I didn't agree with their ideas, ultimately I had to say like, well, but who am I to say that what I agree with or don't agree with is the arbiter of truth? What if Bill O'Reilly is right? What if Sean Hannity makes a good point? And so I listened to that. In retrospect, now I realize how foolish that was, but that was a phase I had to go through, because at that point, I literally did not have a means for adjudicating or discerning between any kind of value judgments. So I was very sort of neutral. And I thought that neutrality was the closest to truth. But it turns out that there are higher ways of looking at things, and that not every side is equally valid. So how to deal with this aperspectival madness, or this multiplicity of perspectives and views, and sorting them out and making sense of which views are more valid than others, which ones are more truthful than others, which ones are more beneficial and healthy, and which ones are more toxic, which ones are more in good faith, which ones are more in bad faith. This is what it took me a good 5 or 10 years to learn, of swimming around in this aperspectival madness. And I think, and it was difficult. Emotionally, it was difficult. You feel lost. And I think that this is precisely why people who are raised into a traditional value system like the Judeo-Christian worldview, or any other value system, Islam or something like that, for it's so difficult to get them up into stage green from stage blue, because in doing so, they become unmoored and they become lost, and they don't want to go through that. And also you start to question everything. You become very skeptical. And that's really where I came to nihilism from, is from a deep skepticism. Early in my teenage years, I just knew that everything had to be questioned. I couldn't take anything on faith, because to take something, even one thing on faith, would open me to a possibility for deep epistemic error. And so basically I questioned everything, including science. And see, most people, if they question the religious norms, that's easy. Questioning the scientific norms, that's really hard. And I fell into that trap too for a while. At first, I started to turn my skepticism towards science, because I suspected that something there was fishy. But as much as I poured my skepticism into it, I just couldn't crack the nut of science. It's too strong. It defends itself so, it has so many ingenious defense mechanisms that get you to believe that it's absolute truth or objective truth, or that it's the best method of arriving to truth that we have. And it's especially difficult to challenge the hard sciences. And I just couldn't wrap my mind around how to do it. I wanted to do it as a skeptic, but I didn't know how. And it would take me probably another decade to succeed in that. But basically, I tried to crack the nut of science, and I couldn't crack it. And as a result, I sort of was resigned to the truths of science because I couldn't crack them. And I was sort of resigned to evolution, and I was sort of resigned to atheism at that point. Because they don't really teach you how to crack the nut of science. Because our society hasn't progressed to that level yet. Although, I mean, they're starting to teach it with stage green in universities, and that's precisely what all the backlash to stage green is about, is because the stage blue people and the stage orange people, the religious people and the scientific people, the atheistic people, the rational people, they do not want their atheism and rationalism deconstructed. And they're going to employ every single trick in their ego's mind to prevent that from happening. So why is nihilism seen as so negative by society? Fundamentally because it undermines the ego. The ego needs to construct meaning and value in order to orient itself and to survive. That is what meaning and value are. Meaning and value are not things found in the outer world. This is basically what nihilism is telling you. And also, to a certain extent, postmodernism. You don't find meaning and value in the outer world. And I mean, a good scientist will tell you this too. Science doesn't prove anything is valuable or meaningful. Strictly speaking, all science does is it measures stuff. That's all it does. It makes predictions. Science can tell you where the moon will be next year. That doesn't tell you if the moon is good or bad. It doesn't tell you whether you should fly to the moon, you should mine the moon, you should nuke the moon, settle the moon. It tells you nothing about what you should do. But you see, us humans were caught in an existential bind for survival. You don't really have an option. As long as you're alive, you're surviving. And in fact, not just having an option, but you have deep instincts from a billion years of evolution for survival. You're instinctually biased towards surviving and against doing airy-fairy philosophy and deconstructing meaning. You can sit here with me today and deconstruct all the meaning you want, and you can even believe it. You can even call yourself a nihilist, but then tomorrow you're going to wake up and go to work and earn your paycheck to pay your electricity and to feed yourself because you're hungry, and the hunger will override any philosophical considerations of nihilism. You see, this is the problem. So it's easy to call yourself a nihilist, but then you don't actually act like it. This is one of the deep problems with nihilism, is that for you to actually live like a nihilist would be very, very challenging. And so a lot of nihilists, they might call themselves that, or they might fancy themselves that way, but that's just some sort of intellectual game they play. They don't actually live that way. And most humans don't live that way, and most humans recognize that that's a bad way to live. But nihilism is treated as negative by society at large because society at large is in the business of constructing a civilization. It has a bias. And the ego hates when its constructions are questioned, because the questioning of these constructions, which are very useful for survival, threatens survival. So for example, if we start questioning money, what money is, and we start telling everyone, hey, you know, the US dollar is just imaginary. It doesn't have any value or meaning. That's going to lead to the destruction of the economy. And most people don't want that. Because most people aren't interested in knowing the dollar is imaginary. They just want to use the dollar to buy their food. See, Western civilization, as it turns out, is a house of cards built on an unquestioned foundation of axioms, assumptions, both metaphysical, epistemic, religious, theological, scientific, linguistic. Even the idea of a Western civilization as a concept itself is a construction. It's a house of cards. Not to mention the idea that Western civilization is the best. That too is a house of cards, you will realize, if you question it, if you dare to question it. And Western civilization has this bias of construction or survival, which means that Western civilization, if it finds some useful falsehood, it would rather go with the useful falsehood than with the truth. Because the falsehood is useful, whereas the truth, what's it going to do for me? So see, if your attitude is very selfish and all you care about is your own comfort and what things are going to do for you, then that opens the floodgates for all sorts of falsehoods, fantasies, and constructions and illusions. And then the problem with that is that as you're building those and you're connecting them together, the more of them you connect together, the more your illusions take on an air of reality. But this is not true reality, it's a pseudo-reality. It's merely that you're writing a novel and you're adding in so many rich details into this novel that you're writing that eventually you get so lost in your own novel, you get so lost in your own bullshit that you forget it was bullshit from the very beginning, that it's a fantasy. It can be fun. It can help you to survive. But also, the problem with it is that it becomes very vulnerable. It becomes vulnerable to deconstruction, and to prevent the deconstruction, this construct, which we might call Western civilization, it starts adding on additional lies and fantasies as defense mechanisms. So for example, science is the foundation of today's Western civilization. In the past, it used to be Christianity, but now it's science and materialism and rationalism and logic and mathematics. So that's the foundation. If you start to question that, you will get so demonized and so attacked because it's virtually impossible to deconstruct that foundation, not because you can't and not because it's true, but simply because people are so defensive about it that they won't even give you the time of day to listen to you, and they won't even want to contemplate it. Because if you can unravel that, you will unravel all of Western civilization. And I've done that in other episodes. You can see me doing that. See my 3-part series, Deconstructing the Myth of Science, where I go very deep into that. But anyways, so what happens with nihilism is that nihilism is kind of like a very deep form of skepticism. Literally leads to a disillusionment. Think of that word, disillusionment. It's the loss of illusion. And the ego doesn't like to lose its illusions. It doesn't feel good to the ego. How do you think a scientist feels who invested 40 years into his PhD work and research and into his academic career? How do you think he will feel if he realizes that the entire foundation of science and academia is built on illusions and fictions and constructions? It's going to lead to an existential crisis. It's going to lead to a nihilism, he would say. And therefore, he associates negativity with that. But that negativity is not inherent to the nihilism. That negativity is simply because you've been building this house of cards. You've been constructing this Ponzi scheme in your own mind, you and collectively with all your friends and colleagues. And then now it's getting unraveled. And that threatens you. Threatens your survival, threatens your livelihood. Maybe you won't be able to feed your kids anymore. That threatens you. That's very scary. To you, it's a matter of life and death. You've built your entire identity around this. So good luck getting one of these scientists to really do a serious deconstruction of science or academia or logic. And of course, they're going to have very good excuses for why, Leo, no, it's not that I don't want to or I can't handle it. Leo, it's just because you're some new ager who has a soft mind and isn't a true scientist. That's the real reason. See, you think you're being rational and truthful. You're not. You're playing games. You're playing ego games. Even when you tell yourself you're being factual and objective and scientific and rigorous and logical and all of that, you tell yourself that that's not ego stuff. That's objective reality. You're being very hard-nosed. And what I'm telling you is that no, all of that is a story you invented as a defense mechanism by your ego to prevent you from actually really doing a serious investigation and deconstruction of the foundations of your mind and reality. And you will say, no, Leo, that's some psychobabble bullshit. And I would just say, that's another story you come up with. Another defense mechanism. See, you have an endless amount of these defense mechanisms. No matter what I say, you're going to have a defense mechanism against it. So that's how the mind works. You have an infinite capacity for denial and rationalization. So you will rationalize away any critique I give because you're not an honest actor. See, you're not interested in truth. You're interested in survival. Now you say, no, Leo, as a scientist, I'm interested in truth. But you aren't. Because if you were truly interested in truth, you would deconstruct science and then you would realize science is not actually truth. But no, Leo, science is truth. Well, that's the social conditioning you were taught that you never questioned. What if science is not truth? See, but you don't want to go down that road. It's too scary. The problem is that you have no clue yet how scary it is to deconstruct science. You think it's just like some philosophy here. Like it's all fun and games. It's just cool ideas. No, it's not cool ideas. This will radically send you into a spiral, a nihilistic spiral, an existential crisis. And then that will be very difficult for you emotionally to deal with. The problem here is not that you're not rational enough, although that is a problem. Your rationality is actually very poor. You're completely distorting and twisting rationality. Your ego has co-opted it as part of survival. But that's not the main problem. The main problem is actually emotional. Emotionally, you actually can't handle the things that I'm saying, which is why you deny it. All right, so let's explicitly tell you how nihilism is right. Nihilism is correct in that life has no meaning and purpose. That's correct. How could it? All meaning and purpose is relative and completely contingent upon one's ego and what one identifies oneself as. All identity is, of course, also completely relative. So what's meaningful to one will not be meaningful to another. And this is so obvious. Just look at history. Look at how mankind behaves. Look at all the conflict and war. It's completely obvious that, like, to Christians, Jesus is meaningful, but to a Buddhist, Jesus is not meaningful. To a Buddhist, Buddha is meaningful. To Christians, Buddha is the devil. Not meaningful, or meaningful in a negative sense. To a Christian, going to church and, eating a wafer that the priest gives you, like in a Catholic church, the Eucharist or whatever it is, that's meaningful, has a lot of meaning. To a Buddhist or to a scientist or an atheist, it looks silly. What does eating this wafer have to do with being spiritual? It's completely relative, right? You might even say, well, yeah, maybe those things are relative. Those are like cultural things. But Leah, what about like science, objective truth? Isn't that meaningful? What about happiness? What about living a good life? What about life itself? Isn't that meaningful inherently? And the answer is no. Why would it be? Why would life be any more meaningful than death? Why would a good life be any more meaningful than a bad life? It's all personal preference. Some people actually enjoy cutting themselves or suffering. In fact, most people enjoy their suffering and don't want to give it up. As far as purposes in life, well, you can have whatever purpose you want. I mean, Hitler had the purpose of exterminating the Jews. That was his purpose. That got his juices flowing. Was that a wrong purpose? Was it a right purpose? It doesn't apply. It was a purpose. That's what he liked. Somebody else might have a purpose to evangelize to the world. Some Christian missionary might travel to Polynesia and convert some heathens there into Christians. Is that a good purpose? Is that a valid purpose? Is that a wrong purpose? It's whatever you imagine it is. Some scientist might have the purpose to explore the galaxy and to discover new scientific truth. Is that a valid purpose? I mean, it all depends. Some scientists might have the purpose of building a nuclear weapon. Is that a good purpose? Again, it all depends. There's no good or bad about these purposes. It's however your ego structures itself and conceives the world. In the end, all these purposes and meanings are just functions of the ego. All value is created by the ego. If you take a look at an object just sitting out in empty space, like the moon has no value. Is that obvious to you that the moon has no value? It only has value relative to your ego's survival. So for example, if you're a businessman and you want to have a mega yacht and you want to live in Beverly Hills, in a $50 million mansion on a hill with a nice view, you might get the idea that you can mine minerals on the moon and then sell them to other humans because other humans want them for survival. It's useful. So you develop some rockets and a space mining, facility up on the moon to get it up on the moon there with the rockets. And then you mine the minerals and you send them down. You mine gold and whatever else is there. You sell it. And then the moon becomes valuable to you because you want to extract stuff from the moon so that you can live in your nice mansion with, you can pay for prostitutes, and you can have nice parties, and you can drive a fancy, Mercedes-Benz or Rolls-Royce, and you can impress your neighbors, and you can feel good about yourself. And in that sense, the moon is valuable to you. But like, is the moon valuable to your dog? No. The moon has zero value to your dog. Is the moon valuable to a tree? No. Is the moon valuable to the universe as a whole? Like, does the universe value the moon more than it values the earth? No. Obviously not. So nihilism is also correct in that all morality is relative, because morality is basically just hinged upon value, meaning, and purpose. So if those are relative, then morality goes as well. What's good, what's bad? It's whatever you decide. And if you look through human history, this is what explains all of the craziness of human history. All of the evil and all of the finger pointing and blaming and all the torture and all the pillaging and raping and Spanish Inquisitions and all this. Why did all this stuff happen? Not only did it happen, but all the people who did that stuff, they thought they were being the good guys as they were doing it. They honestly thought they were the good guys. Why? Because good is nothing other than what your ego thinks is good for it. That's how you define good. There is no absolute good without an ego. How can something be bad if you don't care what happens to you? See, bad stuff only makes sense or has meaning when you define things you don't want to happen to you. Like, you don't want to be tortured, so you define that as bad. But if you didn't care about being tortured, then it wouldn't be bad. Literally. People think that badness is baked into the torture. No. Badness is just your reaction and fear and hatred of it, or the pain it causes you. You might say, well, Leo, but can't we all agree that pain is just bad? Suffering is inherently bad? And the answer is no. Absolutely not. Why would pain and suffering be bad? If you didn't have pain in your life, you would be dead. Pain is the mechanism you use to stay alive. So is suffering. So if you want to eliminate all the suffering in the world, you're stupid. Because without suffering, all the things you love would be dead. Now you might say, Leo, but then we can say death is the worst thing. Death is the bad one. No. Who said that? You value life because you're alive and you're selfish. And that's a bias. Can you see that there's no reason why you should value life over death? Science has not proven that death is bad. And moreover, you can't have life without death. So if you condemn death, then you also condemn life. You must say, no, Leo, in the future, science will be able to get us to a point where we will have eternal life and no death. There will never be such a future. I hate to break it to you. Everything finite dies. The only thing that doesn't die is the infinite. But the infinite isn't alive to begin with, so it doesn't apply. The infinite includes both life and death, and it doesn't distinguish between the two, and it doesn't value one over the other. That's the point. So the idea that death is bad, or suffering is bad, or pain is bad, this is not scientific at all. It's also not rational. So if you think you're being rational or scientific by holding these beliefs, you're not. You just haven't thought through it. Science has no opinion. If you do science properly, science has no opinion about death or life or pain or suffering. In fact, science would tell you that pain and suffering, where did they come from? Through evolution. Why did they evolve? Because they were useful for life. Also, how nihilism is correct is that all of reality is relative. There is no objective world. There is no objective external world. Relativity goes down, not just at the culture. It's not just at the cultural level. It goes way deeper than that. It goes to the ontological level, to the metaphysical level. So you are hallucinating physical reality. I'm not going to explain why or how. I'm not going to prove that to you here. I've talked about that in many other places. We'll keep going down the list. Nihilism is also correct in that the world cannot really be known in the way humans try to know it. So this enterprise of science, thinking that you can sort of just acquire more and more knowledge, accumulate it, and eventually you'll know the whole universe. No, it'll never work because the universe is infinite. And your knowledge is always partial and limited. All your models are just partial perspectives. And you will never get to the full perspective by an accumulation of all of those. So epistemic nihilism, this is called epistemic nihilism, sort of a nihilism towards knowledge in particular. The previous point was we might call that ontological nihilism or metaphysical nihilism, sort of a denial of the physical objective world. Of course, all social institutions and norms are groundless and self-serving. Every social institution is pure selfishness. Doesn't care about the truth. It's not grounded in anything. It's just a house of cards built to perpetuate itself and to serve those who are associated with it. And ultimately, nihilism is correct in that all beliefs are ultimately untrue. I've also talked about that elsewhere. We don't have time to go into an in-depth explanation of why that's the case, but if you are skeptical enough, you'll realize that all beliefs are ultimately untrue. So this is what most people would deny. And this is what nihilism gets right. But what about what nihilism gets wrong? This is also very important. So let's give a list of this. The biggest way nihilism is wrong is that it gives meaninglessness a negative meaning. You have to distinguish here between sort of meaninglessness with a lowercase m versus meaninglessness with an uppercase m. Meaninglessness with a lowercase m is a sort of meaninglessness which sends you into a depression. And the reason it sends you into depression is because you give it a negative meaning, which of course is self-contradicting. Because if you truly realize that the world was meaningless, completely meaningless, you couldn't be depressed about it, you couldn't be negative about it, and it would not be a justification for inaction. Do you see why? Because if you're depressed about it or negative about it, or you want to now use it as a reason to destroy things, but that means you're giving it meaning. It means something to you that the world is meaningless. But that's not meaninglessness, that's meaning. So the problem here is that the nihilism doesn't go all the way. You need to take your nihilism deeper until there's a sort of a going full circle, an inversion, where you go from the lowercase m to the uppercase m, where you truly realize, oh, it's actually absolutely meaningless. That's not bad. It's not negative. It doesn't mean I should destroy things. It doesn't mean even that social institutions are bad. It doesn't even mean that constructions are bad. See, if you take nihilism as this sort of invitation to destroy things because things that are constructed are fictions and houses of cards and are illusions, and that illusion is bad, you don't get it. If you think illusion is bad, you're judging illusion, you're giving meaning to illusion. If you think the US government is bad because it's just a house of cards built on nothing but fantasies and, fairy tales we tell ourselves, from the money to the Constitution that's written on a piece of paper to the language we used to write it, you don't really understand how deeply meaningless it is. It's so meaningless that you shouldn't be pissed off at anything. If you're angsty about stuff, if you're bitter about stuff, if you hate stuff, if you want to kill people, if you're turning into a misanthropic person who doesn't like mankind, all of that you need to recognize is not true nihilism. It is a pseudo-nihilism. It is negative meaning. And that is the ego. That is the ego. And in fact, it's a less functional and more toxic ego than the ego of those people who are actually constructing these illusions and houses of cards. That is a problem. And I think that that's something that normal people, even though they won't be able to articulate this if you talk with them, they have that intuition about nihilism, is that your nihilism is like, what is it going to really do for you? It's going to send you into a depression, and it's going to make you bitter at the world. That's not a good way to live the world, and they're correct about that. You don't want to live. You don't want to live in the world that way. Another thing that nihilism gets wrong is that you can't derive an ought from an is. So if you say that reality is meaningless, that does not mean that now you ought to do something like destroy an institution or destroy science or to kill somebody or to commit suicide. No, reality could be completely meaningless and you could enjoy it. Reality could be completely meaningless and you can buy a ticket to Hawaii and go on the beach and sip your pina colada and enjoy beautiful women sunbathing on the beach. That's perfectly compatible with true nihilism. But see, if you're doing a sort of a pseudo-nihilism, a false nihilism, then you might say, no, that's you're still part of the game and you know, you're not, you got to actually destroy the system, man. No. Why destroy anything? Why is destruction better than creation? Why is creation better than destruction? See, if you're truly a nihilist, you're truly left in this such a neutral position that it actually frees you up to behave in any way you want. And now, if you want to destroy, if you genuinely want to destroy, and that makes you feel good, I guess, okay, go for it. But does it? Does it make you feel good? Is that really what you want? If you think about it, you'll realize, no, I don't want that. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't make others feel good. So why would I do it? Now you can say, well, but if it doesn't make me feel good, so what? Well, can't I be a nihilist and destroy stuff even if it makes me feel bad? And of course the answer is yes, of course you can. Because nihilism completely frees you up to be any way you want. But the question is, do you actually want that? In the end, what it comes down to is just, what do you want? You're confused about what you want. That's the problem. If you cleared that up, you wouldn't be destroying things. Or you would be very careful in what you destroy. Because, I mean, certain things do need to be destroyed, like certain corrupt social institutions. They need to be questioned and reformed. Parts of them need to be destroyed. But this sort of like desire to take a wrecking ball to all of mankind, and even maybe to yourself, and even maybe destroy your own life, this is not going to be a life that you yourself want. So that's a dead end. Another thing that's wrong with nihilism is that it doesn't complete the deconstruction of the ego into awakening and God realization. So the problem is, again, the same way that skepticism is often misused. I've talked about this in my episode called False versus True Skepticism. Oftentimes, the way skepticism and nihilism is used is that it's used to destroy all of the stuff outside of you, and it's not turned in towards you. Really, what you should be doing, you take the wrecking ball of nihilism and skepticism and swing it at yourself. Swing it at that giant ego of yours. Deconstruct that. Before you go deconstructing social systems and governments and even science, deconstruct your own ego. But see, the nihilist doesn't do that. Almost every nihilist that I could run into, I guarantee you they're going to have a giant ego. They're going to have a nihilistic ego. In fact, nihilism itself will become the ego and the identity. But they're not going to be conscious of that. So in fact, they're contradicting themselves. Because see, when the nihilism gets so deep, the nihilism has to destroy itself too. But most nihilists aren't willing to do that because that's too threatening for the ego to do. So what the ego does is the ego co-opts nihilism as part of its survival strategy. And then what I would say is that the survival strategy of nihilism, if you're going to use it for that, is very dysfunctional. And in this sense, normies are correct. Jordan Peterson is correct. Nihilism as a survival strategy in life ain't so good. It's not going to work out for you. But there is a deeper, truer nihilism which leads to awakening if you take it that far. But that means deconstructing your ego. So another thing that nihilism gets wrong is that mostly what nihilism is as a philosophy is it's just stuck at the level of belief and concept. It's not actualized. It's also turned into a political ideology sometimes, like maybe anarchism. That's also an invalid use of nihilism. Nihilism doesn't make any political prescriptions, truly. If you think government is bad and evil, you're not being a proper nihilist. And finally, what nihilism gets wrong is that it overlooks what happens when you reach the bottom of nihilism. If you go all the way down the rabbit hole of nihilism, eventually what happens is that you awaken. Everything loses meaning, but then after that, you go through the dark night of the soul, and then the ego dies, and then you awaken to God. Not as a belief, not as some Christian fairy tale. God as consciousness. Consciousness as the only real thing. So what nihilism overlooks is that, yes, the Christian versions of God were stupid, and so are many of the other religious versions of God. Yes, religion is pretty stupid. It's filled with dogma and bullshit and so forth, and the meaning it comes up with is a false pseudo-meaning, but it's missing the very soul and heart of reality, which is that you're God, that God is everything, that God is beauty, God is love, God is divinity, spirit, goodness, truth, consciousness, all as absolutes. So the paradox of meaninglessness is that when it completely collapses, you actually discover infinite love and absolute goodness, which is everything. And then you realize, oh, all these stupid nihilistic beliefs and philosophies I had, all these philosophers I read, the existentialists, Nietzsche and all this, they were all deluded, and I was just using them as a defense mechanism against the realization of what I am as God, infinite love. And then you're no longer depressed. You no longer want to destroy at that point. At that point, you so fall in love with yourself and with reality that you actually rediscover a higher purpose. And the higher purpose is to help mankind to awaken. Not because you have to, not because someone told you, not because religion tells you, not because it's a moral tradition or a norm, but simply because that's what God would do. That's what consciousness does. Consciousness is a self-awakening system. Everything that happens within consciousness is just a means to help consciousness awaken to itself in the absolute sense, in the biggest picture sense. And then you just, when you relinquish your selfish needs and concerns, you lose yourself. And then when you lose yourself, you just become a force of the universe for its own awakening. In whatever means that might be. It might be art, it might be teaching, it might be engineering, it might be science, it might be politics, whatever. There's a million ways that you could do that. And then your life takes on the highest and deepest meaning. But this meaning, it's not a constructed meaning, really. It's you realize that all meaning is a construction, but awakening is not a construction. The universe awakening to itself, that's not a construction. That's an absolute. And so what the nihilist is overlooking is the existence of the absolute. And that's a problem a lot of people have. When I start talking about absolute truth, many scientific and atheistic and rational people, they scratch their heads and they just can't open their minds to the possibility of the existence of an absolute truth. But consider that you're wrong and that absolute truth does actually exist. Not as a concept or a belief, but absolutely. This is it. You're in absolute truth right now. You just don't realize it. So, criticisms of nihilism, as with many things, like I said before, that distinction of criticism from above or from below. A criticism of nihilism from below would be one coming from traditional values, and it's fear-based. It's from an ego, basically. So like a Christian, or maybe someone like Jordan Peterson might criticize nihilism on the grounds that it's going to lead to a bad life, a bad marriage, and an inability to function in the world. And that comes from a place of fear because it's like it's going to be total chaos. Relativity is going to lead to total chaos and society will fall apart. This is a fear-based, shadow-based criticism from below of nihilism. This only comes because that ego mind that is making that criticism has not itself actually gone through the nihilistic process. And you can tell because it's avoidant and is scared of that process. That's why it's doing the criticizing. The criticism is a defense mechanism. This is why traditionally oriented people are very fearful of nihilism. Like if you have Christian parents and you come home with a nihilist textbook, you're going to freak them out. But then there's criticisms of nihilism from above. So I criticize nihilism a bit in this episode from above. And the difference is that I've actually gone through the nihilism. I was a nihilist with a lowercase n, and then I became a nihilist with an uppercase n. And then what I realized is that nihilism itself is self-defeating, and it's conceptual, and that there's something deeper than nihilism, which is just infinite consciousness and love and God. It's the thing that people like Jordan Peterson think they're defending when they're defending traditional values against nihilism, but actually which is paradoxically the very thing which is keeping them from realizing God and love and from understanding religion. So if I was debating a nihilist, I could tell him all sorts of things he's got wrong about his worldview, but it would be coming from above because I went through what he's going through. I've been where he's been stuck. And I can see how his nihilism is just another piece of clothing that the ego has adorned. It's a defense mechanism from deconstructing the ego. It's important before you critique nihilism that you first acknowledge its core truths. The core truths of nihilism, which are correct, is that everything is absolutely groundless and relative. The world is inherently devoid of meaning in a very radical sense, and that all value is self-biased. But the trick is that all applies to nihilism itself too. There's a deep, twisted, strange, loopy self-reflection that happens here, which most nihilists are not aware of. So to get to the uppercase N nihilism from a lowercase n nihilism, you gotta do the self-reflection, complete the loop, do the strange loop, and realize that your own nihilism eats its own tail. Ouroboros style. So the problem with nihilism is not that it goes too far, it's that it doesn't go far enough. The ego is never fully deconstructed because the nihilism is kept at the level of philosophy. See, the ego is so safe with philosophy because it's just concepts. The ego loves to take anything actual that will change your life and turn it into an idea or a philosophy or a concept or a model. So you got to take it below philosophy and into actual embodiment, actual practice. So the ego is never deconstructed. The negativity of nihilism is not fully deconstructed. Survival itself is not deconstructed. Science and materialism are not deconstructed. If you deconstruct all those, now you're becoming a true nihilist. Capital N nihilist. Which is just to say, you're becoming a mystic. A mystic is just a nihilist who went all the way, who took it from philosophy to embodiment. It sounds so counterintuitive because, like, for example, if I would tell that to Jordan Peterson, that a mystic is just a radical nihilist, I'm pretty sure he would disagree with me very vehemently. He'd have a lot of defenses and excuses for why that's not true. Because it's so unacceptable to a traditionally oriented person, to a conservative, that mysticism is literally just nihilism actualized. For example, to tell a Christian that Jesus was a radical nihilist, which he was, effectively, this is the last thing they would accept. In fact, they would call me a Satan worshiper or something like that. So spirituality is nihilism. That's the thing everybody is missing. They think that spirituality and nihilism are somehow opposed to each other. They're not. They're spirituality, just nihilism actualized. You see, most people's attachments to the material world and to their ideas and to their ideology and to meaning, most of this is socially conditioned. They did not create any of it consciously. They didn't sit down and decide it and think it through rationally. They were just born into it. And this includes science and logic and mathematics and all of this hard stuff. This is all social conditioning. The only reason you believe in science or in evolution or mathematics or logic or anything is because it was programmed into your mind like religion. You didn't consciously choose it. Even if you're a scientist, you didn't consciously choose it. And so the value of nihilism is that it can wipe the slate clean of all the social conditioning. It allows you to deconstruct everything. And then the value of that, and this is where Nietzsche was right, is that now you can, from that clean slate, develop your own meaning in life, your own purpose, your own system of values. And when you do that, that's going to make you more spiritual than any other person who professes to be spiritual under the social conditioning model. Because spirituality is not something you can be socially conditioned into. Spirituality only comes from your own consciousness. And your own consciousness is hindered by all of the social conditioning. So it's very paradoxical that by questioning and doubting and destroying Christianity and Hinduism and Islam and even Buddhism and atheism and rationality and science, by doing all of that, you will actually become truly deeply spiritual. And you will become very authentic. And you will become very grounded and strong as an individual. You will become a powerful leader. And you will start to become truly satisfied with your life, because you can't be satisfied with a life based upon the social conditioned values of other people, which are not authentic to you. So spirituality is not only awakening and deconstructing everything, but spirituality is also discovering what you truly value in life. Now you might say, but Leo, but all the values are constructions. Yes, but the difference is that once you go through the nihilism and you burn everything to the ground, then, and you become conscious that all of reality is imaginary, then it's like you're in a dream, right? You realize you're in a dream. You realize there's nothing to do in a dream but to play. So you're going to be playing games now, and you can play the game however you want. And then you can be honest with yourself and ask yourself, okay, so how would I play the game if I was totally free and unattached and I wasn't coming at this game from a position of neediness or attachment or fear, but from a place of love? And now I can play the game from a place of love. How do I want to manifest my love in the world according to my own personal preferences? Because you're still going to have preferences. The difference, though, is that you don't hold your preferences as absolutes. You don't try to force your preferences on others. See, like maybe you don't like eating pork, but now you're not going to force others not to eat pork. You're going to have sort of a very detached, hands-off approach to life. You can have preferences and biases, even awakened people do, but you're not going to be normative about them. You're not going to be needy about them. You're not going to fool yourself into thinking that these personal preferences are absolute in some sense. You're not going to fool yourself with the idea that Western civilization is the best one, or that my religion is the best one, or that my God is the true one, or that my science is the only way to look at the world, or that logic is the only way to look at the world. You're not going to be fooled and limited by these sorts of ideas anymore. So you free yourself up. You're literally liberating your mind. And again, remember, when you do the nihilism properly, you're not holding construction and illusion as a bad thing. Illusion has a negative connotation in our society, but it's really not. Illusion is reality. Illusion is a dream. It's a play. You're in a play. It's a drama for your own entertainment. Maybe this bums you out, but you got to get past that. And then eventually you'll come out the other end and you'll realize how beautiful that is. This is the greatest gift. The fact that reality is an illusion is not something to be bummed out about. It's the greatest gift because that means there's nothing to fear. It's a game. Play it. Enjoy it. There's nothing else to do. Enjoy the fucking game. Construct whatever meanings you want and be honest with yourself that you're constructing it. Construct it consciously rather than unconsciously. That's the only problem. That's really the key difference. Is that a person with traditional values, like Jordan Peterson, is not consciously constructing the value set. It's been programmed into him and he's unconsciously defending it, clinging to it. Now, he intuits that it's pointing towards something higher, and he's right about that, but he's never going to reach that something higher until he's willing to let go of those social conditions and those beliefs and those concepts and ideas and the ego and identity that's been built around it. This is how you become Nietzsche's Übermensch, the Superman. This is what the Superman is. The Superman is living completely from his or her own core, authentic inner core, inner motivations that run far deeper than anything that society can program into you. Consciousness cannot be programmed. It's not mechanical because it's not finite, it's infinite. It's an infinite intelligence. So as the Superman or Superwoman, you're living from this place of deep consciousness and living presence and intelligence, which is the God within you that animates you, that makes you passionate, that makes you enthused, which is spirit. Enthusiasm means to be filled with the Spirit of God, to be truly passionate about life, to be driven by love. This cannot be given to you by any human because it's a superhuman capacity. When humans try to give that to you or teach it to you, those are all poor substitutes and facsimiles of the actual thing. You can't turn intelligence and consciousness and love into algorithms because they're infinite. You can't encapsulate the truth in any system of human design because it's infinite. So what nihilism deeply intuits is that all of the human constructions of society and morality and religion, all this and science even, is that it's all petty human bullshit. Humans take their own constructions so seriously when really humans are just bullshitters. That's what humans are. They're bullshitting all the time, even when they're scientists. They're full of shit. It's just that simple. It's so simple. It's so obvious once you realize it. If you go into every human situation, whether it's a business deal, a relationship, a marriage, dealing with kids, dealing with friends, entertainment, art, science, academia, government, religion, go into any of these institutions and activities and just go in there with the assumption that this whole thing is full of shit. It's all bullshit. And you will be right 95% of the time. But don't tell them that because they'll kick you out. They don't like being told that because it's too true. It's profoundly true. See, people don't like being called out on their bullshit. They get offended. They start attacking you. So here I'll also connect nihilism with a concept from mythology and from Joseph Campbell, and also some of the stuff that Jordan Peterson teaches is the hero's journey. I'm really big on the hero's journey, but people like Jordan Peterson and so on, they don't. Even Joseph Campbell didn't understand what the hero's journey was really about. I have an episode called "The Highest Hero's Journey." Go check that out. It's very important. I also talk about it in my life purpose course. Go check that out. It basically shows you how to do your hero's journey related to your career. Very powerful. But the hero's journey, I explained it in that video about the highest hero's journey. The hero's journey has these various stages and steps that you go through. Hopefully you still remember some of those. It's a long video that long time ago that I shot that video. Basically, the hero sets out on the journey. Then he faces threshold guardians. It's difficult. He gets defeated by the threshold guardians. He perseveres. He finds the wizard or the wise old man who gives him knowledge and wisdom and gives him a weapon or some sort of boon. He takes that weapon and that wisdom and he uses it to face down the threshold guardians and defeat them one by one by one. Eventually, he defeats enough of those. And then finally, he encounters the deepest, his deepest obstacle, sort of the monster that he's trying to destroy. Here, like the final boss of the game, you might say. He tries to battle this monster, this final boss. He fails. He's not strong enough. And then he enters what's called the belly of the whale. The belly of the whale is the lowest point in the journey. It's your deepest turning inwards into yourself to really figure out, do I have what it takes to defeat the final boss? And to defeat the final boss, what you need is, you don't need a magic sword. It's not the problem. It's not that your sword is not big enough or that you don't have enough health potions or something material like that. The problem, the bottleneck ultimately is your own heart and soul. Your spirit. Is your spirit steeled enough for the battle ahead? And it's in the belly of the whale that really the boss is defeated. Because physically the boss is out there. You're in the belly of the whale by yourself, alone, facing your own self, your own weaknesses, your own ego. What happens in the belly of the whale is that you finally face your own deepest inner weaknesses and self-esteem issues and all that, and you come out of that. You might call that the dark night of the soul. And then finally, you're spiritually steeled enough now to go fight the final boss, and now victory against the final boss is guaranteed. Because the true victory was already won in the belly of the whale. So nihilism is the belly of the whale. But the problem is that the belly of the whale is the place where very few are willing to go. That's the lowest point in the spiritual journey. That's where the real spiritual work happens. And so people invent all sorts of external excuses for distractions and doing stuff that is not actually going and taking them into the belly of the whale. And people might demonize the belly of the whale. They might say it's dangerous, it's bad, and it is from the standpoint of ordinary life. If you're living your ordinary life, you're not battling some giant boss monster, then for you, entering the belly of the whale is a bad thing. It's difficult. But if you come out of it, then you'll be a true hero. The hero's journey is just God realization. That's what the whole thing is about. It's a myth. It's a mythic archetype that shows you how to reach God realization, how to realize your own true self as God. So going through nihilism is necessary, and it makes you stronger. It makes your mind stronger. So don't fear it. Just go through it. You have to be careful because you can go through it in a dysfunctional way where you end up killing yourself. You don't want to do that. I talk about in other videos some of the different traps and mistakes you can make going on this journey. I have a video called The Dangers of Spiritual Work, which explains there are real dangers. I mean, it's dangerous. Being a hero is dangerous. Fighting a dragon, defeating a giant final boss dragon monster is dangerous. It's difficult. It's a more difficult life than just living complacently in mediocrity, going to your 9-to-5 job, and just punching the clock and just doing what everybody else in society is doing. That's the difference between not being a hero and being a hero. So the tragedy for the lowercase n nihilists is that they never realized that God was nothing. Nihilism literally means nothing. And what you realize at the end of the journey, once you defeat the dragons and everything, is that you're left with nothing. God is nothing. These nihilists were so close, and yet they were so far. And they don't understand what nothing is. The nihilist idea of nothing is not what God actually is. God is an infinite, loving nothing, which a nihilist usually doesn't comprehend. The purpose of spiritual practice is nihilism. Meditation. Nihilism. That's what it is. You're trying to shut down your mind to zero. So look at this. Nihilism in theory as a philosophy leads to depression, angst, negativity, destruction, and anarchy, and chaos, and a bad life and suffering. Whereas nihilism fully actualized, not as a philosophy, but actualized, leads to enlightenment, sainthood, God, consciousness, love, and truth, and a playful, joyful life. It also leads to immortality, by the way. Because nothing, what's the one thing that can't die? Nothing. By the way, if you're confused here, when I say nothing, I'm not talking about the nothing you think of, and I'm not talking about non-existence. Nothingness is not non-existence. It exists. Nothing exists. Non-existence does not exist. There's no such thing as non-existence. There's only existence. So, very counterintuitively, meaninglessness goes full circle into liberation. See my episode called The Theme of Things Going Full Circle. And also see my episode called The Counterintuitive Nature of Life. Both of those episodes give many examples of this sort of going full circle effect, which leads to a lot of counterintuitive results and conclusions in life. A lot of times you think you're going towards something, and then it ends up actually leading you all the way back to where you started in a cyclical or spiral manner. The really deep irony here is so interesting is that those who reject nihilism are actually the devils. Because the devil is the ego, scared of losing all of its constructions. Go check out my episode called What is the Devil?, where I explain that, one of my best episodes. It'll open your eyes as to how evil functions. Huh? So ironically, it's the Christians and the Muslims and the Buddhists and the Hindus who are the devils. The atheists are also devils. The scientists and rationalists are also devils. Metaphorically speaking, in that they're selfish and they're not willing to give up their self. And they're not willing to give up their constructions. The devil is busy defending his constructions. The constructions are always finite and they always separate the devil from God. So the devil is just busy lurking in the shadows, away from the light, avoiding the light of God. Ta-da. And of course, the devil co-opts spiritual truths to put on a facade of spiritual work. So some of the biggest devils are the people who portray themselves to be the most spiritual, which is why you see these sorts of scandals with Christian evangelicals and other, religious hypocrites. And people don't really like religion for this reason, because it's so obvious how hypocritical those religious preachers are. And that's the reason that is because they've got egos that they haven't deconstructed, and their Christianity and their religion didn't give them the tools necessary to do the deconstruction. So God is nothing, God is void, God is groundless, the groundless ground, God is shunyata, God is emptiness, God is cessation, God is nirvana, God is mu, God is consciousness. Now you might say, but Leo, maybe that's true for the Buddhists, but it's not true for the Hindus, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, and so on. Actually, it is. It's true for all of them. What the Christians call love, it's nothingness, actually. What the Hindus call Shiva is nothingness. What the Jews call Ein Sof, their name for God, is nothingness. The Muslims, the Sufis, they refer to the deepest spiritual realization as fana al-fana, which translates as the passing away of the passing away. It's a nihilism so deep that it even erases itself. It's a self-erasing eraser. Fana al-fana. That is Allah. And I have an episode called Aztec Non-Duality, where I talk about the Aztec religion and Teotl, if you still remember. You remember Teotl? That's actually a really powerful episode. Go watch that one. It explains a lot about the nature of God. Teotl, there it's explained, I give a lot of quotes in that episode. It's explained that Teotl is an infinite shapeshifter that has no form of its own. In other words, Teotl is nothingness or emptiness. So ask yourself this: why are you so threatened by nothing? If your worldview is true, as you believe it is, like if you're a scientist and you believe your worldview is true, then why are you so scared of deconstructing it? If it was true, deconstruction couldn't harm it. And you wouldn't be so triggered and emotional about defending it. The way you get to truth is you burn everything to the ground, and then whatever remains is the truth. The problem, of course, and your ego mind intuits this, is that if you truly do burn everything in your life to the ground, nothing will survive. Your science won't survive. Your religion won't survive. Jordan Peterson's ideas won't survive. Sam Harris's ideas won't survive. Your ideas of God won't survive. Your atheism won't survive. The biggest challenge in this work is admitting that everything you knew was wrong. It takes an enormous humility to admit that. Can you just see that the reason most people don't do this work is because they simply don't have the humility to admit that everything they believe is wrong? Now, see, sometimes people criticize me and they say, Leo, but you're so fucking arrogant. How dare you talk about humility? I might come across as arrogant, as though I'm talking down to you sometimes. That's mostly just a stylistic thing. What people don't understand is that deep down, epistemically, I'm extremely, extremely humble. And they would say, Leo, that's outrageous. How dare you say that? That's so arrogant of you to say. I realize the irony and paradox of it. How dare you say that? You give definitive statements about God and absolute truth and about science. You say you know all this stuff. Only an arrogant narcissist would say such things. Or I spent 20 years deconstructing my mind and my reality, coming from a place of deep epistemic humility, questioning absolutely everything about myself to the point where I deconstructed it all, and then what I was left with was absolute truth. And then you say, but Leo, if you were truly humble, you would even question that. No, that wouldn't be humility. That would be stupidity. You don't question absolute truth once you find it. You found it. You've arrived. That's it. It's the end of your ideas of being humble or arrogant. It doesn't matter anymore. Humility and arrogance, these are just social games you play. Again, your judgments of me as being arrogant or whatever, this is just more defense mechanisms for you. It's a convenient excuse for you not to listen to what's actually being said and pointed to. Which is not to say that I can't work on my delivery and make it more appealing and comforting to your ego and so forth, and a little less arrogant in its style, a little less sort of definitive. You see, just because I say something definitively, this doesn't make me arrogant per se. I'm the biggest skeptic that there is. It's just that you don't see my skeptical process because it was done years ago. I was doing skepticism and nihilism back in my when I was 17 years old. You don't see that today, because this is what you get when you sort of come out from the other end of the belly of the whale. Okay, so now let's get to the part where I actually give you some practical tips on how to deal with nihilism and relativity. So if you're entering stage green, and stage green is deep, like I said before, you can go very deep on stage green. You enter very deep on stage green and you start to realize that everything is perspective. You don't know, is the left wing more right than the right wing? Is the right wing more right than the left wing? What kind of economy should we have? Are the socialists right? Are the capitalists right? Who's wrong? Who's right? You don't even know if Leo is right. You don't even know if Actualized.org is right. Because if you're truly going through this nihilistic process, then you might say, well, okay, Leo says all this stuff, but he's just one guy. He could be deluded. He could be wrong. It could be just a partial perspective. What if Leo is no better than a fundamentalist Christian or Muslim? What if Actualized.org is just another one of those things? What if it's whatever, a cult or whatever? You don't know. How could you know unless you have finished the process? So you're in this place, and then you also might think well, especially if you're young, like college age, you might be thinking well, what kind of career should I have? Should I be a writer? Should I be an artist? Should I be a business person? Should I pursue money? Should I pursue my passions? If I pursue my passions, where will I get my money? If I pursue my money, then I'll hate it and I won't have my passions. What kind of major should I major in? What should I do in university? Should I go to university? Should I go get a job? Should I go into the business world? Should I go on Wall Street? Should I chase, stock investing in cryptocurrency? Should I build up a big nest egg and then go do my passion? Or should I do my passion now while I'm, penniless? What should I do? And then you're lost. So how do you handle this? I went through a lot of this in late high school and early college. Basically, your problem is that you need to find yourself. And you can't find yourself unless you lose yourself. And the reason most people don't find themselves is because they're too afraid of losing themselves and going deep into this nihilistic, relativistic process. The way that I handled it in my youth is I sort of came to this conclusion. I was stuck in this multi-perspectivalism and neutrality, non-judgment. But then I realized, okay, we have to make a distinction between absolute truth and relative truth. That's a distinction I made very early on in my teens. And I basically said that religion, science, these sorts of things, they're not absolutely true, but they might have relative truths to them. And even though it might not be absolutely true that, for example, right-wing talk radio conservatives are more wrong than, or right, whichever, than liberals and progressives. So maybe I can't adjudicate this conflict of ideology and politics at the level of the absolute truth, but I can look at it at the level of relative truth. For example, I can just look at what will make for a better society. Like, for example, I could ask myself the question when it comes to liberals and conservatives, I can ask the question of well, who should I vote for? Should I vote for Republican or Democrat? Well, in the absolute sense, from absolute perspective, you could say it doesn't matter and I can't know. But from the relative perspective, I can say do I care about the environment? Do I want a cleaner, healthier environment? If I do, then I should vote for liberals rather than conservatives, because conservatives don't give a fuck. Do I think that there's a problem in our society if the middle class is shrinking from both sides and we have this gap between the very poor and the very rich at the top, and that's growing over time? Is that going to lead to a society I want to live in that I will enjoy? And my answer is no. Well, which party cares about that? The liberals. The conservatives don't give a fuck. And so you're thinking more from a survival perspective. And so basically, what I realize is that from the absolute perspective, I don't really know the truth. But from the relative perspective, I still have preferences. Like there's things I want out of life. I want to live a passionate life. That's something I knew I wanted. Not because it's absolutely true. Not because some God is forcing me to. Not because I'm going to go to hell if I don't. Not because I'm going to go to heaven in afterlife. Not because science says so. But simply because I want a passionate life. And that in and of itself is valid. It's its own valid thing. And also another point that I made, this is very important lesson from this, going through this nihilism, is that you learn, what it teaches you is you learn not to rationalize and justify your preferences and biases in terms of objective truths or normative statements. So what I mean by that is that usually when an ordinary human is pursuing something in their life, they're going to try to ground it in some absolute truth or norm. They're going to try to make it objective. They're going to rationalize it in their mind. So like if they're pursuing a family, rather than just saying, you know what, I'm just selfish and I just want to have a family. I want to, I like playing with kids. I think I'll enjoy that. I like having a wife. I like the companionship of it. I'll just enjoy that. And I'm just doing it for selfish purposes. See, instead of being honest and admitting that to yourself, what most people do, traditional people, is to say, oh, well, a family, this is good for society. God wants me to have a family. And, we really need this family to maintain our civilization. So they come up with all these fucking rationalizations. When really, you just want to be honest with yourself about your biases. You can have biases and preferences, just admit them to yourself. You might say, well, Leo, that makes no difference. It actually makes a very big difference. Because when you admit to yourself that what you're pursuing in life is nothing other than your own selfishness and biases and preferences, and you don't try to ground it in genetics or biology or some sort of story about how, well, I'm going to go in business and I'm going to compete against that business because it's survival of the fittest. And you have this whole story about how actually it's the fittest who survived, the fittest deserve to win and this and that. No, just tell yourself you're a selfish fuck and you want money for sex. Tell yourself that. That would be more honest than coming up with some sort of, survival of the fittest and perpetuating the species and this. I mean, it's fucking ridiculous. The reality is you're horny and you want sex. It has nothing to do with evolution, from your perspective. And if you if you're going to be a Christian, but then say to yourself, I'm not a Christian because being a Christian is the absolute truth. I'm a Christian because I was born in a particular part of the world where Christianity was popular. I was indoctrinated with it. I have these preferences now. I'm stuck with them. And I'm going to go with it. This is my preference. It's purely arbitrary. It's not about truth. It's not about the Bible. This is just purely arbitrary. I prefer these things over, let's say, Hinduism. And so I'm going to do that because I prefer it. I enjoy it. I enjoy the Christian God more than I enjoy the Hindu gods. Why? Just because I'm selfish and I'm biased. And that's what I grew up in. See, if you admit that, that would be truthful. And then you wouldn't have to play these defensive games anymore. And you would have freedom from ideology. Likewise with science. Admit to yourself that science is just something you were culturally conditioned into. And that you have a preference for it, but that it's not the best, it's not the truest. There could be important truths in Christianity that you haven't been taught in science and so forth, and then you'll have a much healthier attitude towards science. Also, an important way to deal with this relativity and nihilism is to study lots of perspectives. That's one of the things you'll actually be doing when you're in this nihilistic funk. And this period could last for 2 to 5 years of your life, maybe more. Very much depends on you and how you go about it. But during this period, what you will do is you will read lots of books. If you're doing it properly, you'll watch lots of videos, you'll study lots of teachers, lots of different traditions, and you will get different perspectives. These perspectives will confuse the shit out of you in the beginning. You won't know how to make heads or tails of these perspectives. Some of these perspectives will be bad. Some of them will be better. And you'll have biases towards different ones, and you're going to have to just kind of like play around with them and not get married to anyone. and you can play them off each other. You can cross-reference them, sort of triangulate them to get closer to truth. What should help you is if you make the distinction between lower quality versus higher quality perspectives, because not all perspectives are equal. That's the difficulty of really being lost in relativity, is that you literally start to think that all perspectives are equal. And even when I tell you that not all perspectives are equal, you will say, well, Leo, that's just also a perspective, and it's also equal to all the other perspectives. So the perspective that all perspectives are equal, and the perspective that some perspectives are not equal to others, that this itself is a sort of a meta perspective, and that too is whatever. I don't know how to make sense of it. See, here you get really lost in a perspectival madness. But eventually you have to live your life. And what you realize is that how you're living your life exhibits certain biases and preferences you have. So you can't live life neutrally. Even if you say, well, I'm going to do nothing in my life at all because I want to align with perfect neutrality and perfect relativity. I'll do nothing. But that itself is a choice you've made. That itself is an action. So you're stuck in life in such a way, you're situated in such a way, you're in such an existential bind that you have to act somehow, and even non-action is action. Even non-choice is choice. So when you realize that, what you realize is, well, choices get made no matter what. There's a default position no matter what. If I do nothing, something will still happen. I'm not really at a blank slate. I've already got ideas programmed into my mind, whether scientific ones, religious ones, Christian ones, Hindu ones, Buddhist ones, whatever. And that is what will be running the show if I make no changes and I pretend to just be neutral. I won't actually be neutral by being neutral. See, when you really grasp this, this now starts to help you to actually choose things, because you realize that you can't avoid choosing things. Even if you're going to die, starve yourself, you're still choosing that. So you can't escape making a choice. And when you realize that, then you have to realize that, well, what kind of choices do I want to make? What will make for a good life? And you realize that basically what you want is you want a good life. That's the point of life, is to create a good life. You're free to create whatever life you want. All of this relativity, all of these perspectives, in a sense, is sort of like you're a little kid and I come to you and I dump a giant garbage truck load of Legos in your room. Like literally a metric ton of Lego pieces of every possible type and color. And with these Lego pieces, you can construct anything. And then that's how life is. And then sort of life asks you, what are you going to construct? You might say, well, what difference does it make what I construct? I can construct a castle or a spaceship or a gas station or a car, whatever. Does it matter which one? Is one better than the other? And if nobody tells me, like you might, as a child, you might say, well, tell me which one is the best to construct and I'll build it. And then what if there's no response? What do you do? Well, you can say, well, fuck it then I'm not going to build anything. Okay, but then that's what you chose. You have built something. You built nothing. Is that what you want? Is that going to make you happy? If it is, do that. If it isn't, why not do something that makes you happy? Why make yourself miserable in life? So see, by going through this chain of logic, you realize, oh yeah, the only thing left to do in life is to make myself happy. But then what makes me happy? I don't know. I don't know what makes me happy. I think I might know, but how do I know that what I think I know will actually make me happy? And maybe I'll try some of those things and I'll realize it doesn't make me happy. That could be useful feedback to figure out what does make me happy. So the point of life is to basically play with these Legos, build different things, and to realize like, well, yeah, I've built this castle. I don't like castles. I built a pirate ship. I don't like pirate ships. I built this car. I don't like cars. I built this gas station. I don't like gas station. So at some point you build something and you say, oh, I built something. I built this unicorn. Oh, I like unicorns. I like animals. So maybe now I should start building more animal Legos. So now you build a giraffe. It's like, oh, I like the giraffe even more than the unicorn. Okay. And then you build a dragon. You're like, oh, I like dragons even more. I like fantastical monsters. So now you start to build, chimeras and manticores and goblins and things. And then you, through this process, you discover like, oh, this is what I love about life, is building these mystical creatures. And the more outlandish and mystical they are, the more excited I get. And this is what Joseph Campbell called following your bliss. And through this process, you discover your life purpose. I talk about that more in my 25-hour life purpose course. Check that out. So you see, and the trick is that you never fool yourself in this process that dragons and manticores and goblins are better than anything else. Because the other kids, when they're playing with their Legos, what they do, first of all, they're playing with a very limited set of Legos. You're playing with like a dump truck full of them, and they're playing with like 100 pieces. Their pieces are very limited. Their colors are very limited. So what they can build is very limited. And all that they're building is what every other kid around them is building. So if the kids around them are building castles, they end up building castles, even though they probably don't like castles, but they build it anyways because everyone's building castles. And if I don't build a castle, people are going to think I'm weird and I'm too weak to stand up against that. And I haven't discovered what I really like to build. And what I can build is so minuscule compared to what that kid can build with a dump truck full of different Legos. And when somebody brings some additional Legos, in addition to the 100 that I'm comfortable with, they bring another 100 that are totally new and unique and different colors and shapes and stuff. They bring that to me and I look at it, I'm like, ooh, that's evil. That's wrong. That's not the kind of Legos we play around with here. Those aren't castle pieces. I only want castle pieces. And then now there's a fight and a debate about why those are bad and these castle pieces are the best and God has ordained these castle pieces. He hates the pirate ship the pirate ship pieces. Those are from the devil, or those are irrational, illogical. They're too mystical. These creatures, like if you're doing this from a scientific perspective, you might be building like a spaceship, right? You're building a spaceship. You're this science nerd, logic nerd. And then I come to you and I show you my like fantastical Lego dragon, unicorn, manticore, goblin creatures. And you look at them and you're like, oh my God, what kind of airy, fairy tale woo-woo stuff is that? That's not scientific. The only thing you can build with Lego pieces is spaceships. That's the only valid use of Lego pieces. It has to be rational. Everything has to be perfect squares and corners. It has to be scientifically accurate, not these fucking monsters that you build. And then I go, well, here's some monster pieces that you can use to make like organic living ships and stuff. And the guy's like, no, that's not how you build ships. Those aren't valid ships. That's not scientific. That's not rational. I don't want to build your irrational ships. I want to build my little simplistic ships. The way that all my friends do. See? And so you artificially constrain yourself to a much narrower life. And you get less joy from life. And you know what the funny thing is? Is that you might not even enjoy building those spaceships. You might actually want to build dragons, but you're too scared and your mind is too paradigm locked to venture out into that space. So anyways, as you're dealing with this nihilism, you want to be studying lots of different perspectives so you have a lot of grist for the mill. It's going to leave you very confused, and that's okay. I have an episode actually called How to Deal with Confusion. Confusion is when the ego mind doesn't know how to make sense of reality. Most people are scared of confusion, and they think it's a bad thing. They think not knowing is a bad thing. You're also going to be not knowing a lot of stuff. And so the solution is to just embrace not knowing. Don't view it as a negative thing. Embrace confusion and just trust the process. Trust that as you're going through life and you're studying a lot of different perspectives. First of all, this is fun. It's fucking fun. Treat it as fun. Play with ideas. Play with perspectives. And trust that slowly over time, pieces like a puzzle will start to fit together. And you will develop some criteria for adjudicating between lower perspectives and higher perspectives. I can give you some of this criteria, but again, you can't just believe it. You have to verify it for yourself. So in a sense, what you're doing is you're sort of building up your own epistemology from scratch by questioning everything. This is very, very healthy to do. So what are some signs that a perspective is higher or lower? Fear, hatred, judgment, violence, rejection of certain parts of reality, and dogma and ideology and clinging and attachment. These are all telltale signs of lower perspectives. Lower perspectives are all those things. They're closed-minded. They're selfish. They're fear-based. They're hatred-based. They're based on us versus them. They're based on denial of certain aspects of reality and the demonization thereof. They also try to monopolize perspective. In other words, when a perspective says that, ignore other perspectives, just focus on me, just me, my perspective is the best one, all the other ones are stupid. When a perspective does that, it's a lower class perspective. Because it's being selfish. How about the higher perspectives? What distinguishes those? Well, basically the opposite of that. Higher perspectives are open, they're non-monopolistic, they're interested in exploring more perspectives. They don't lock you down into one perspective. In fact, they imagine a perspective that tells you that you should study all the perspectives. They're meta, they have a meta quality, they're selfless, they're loving, they're fearless, they're courageous, they're playful, they're exploratory. They're more nuanced and sophisticated, they're more complex. They're more systemic, they're more holistic. They're more self-aware. In other words, there are some perspectives that are aware that they are a perspective, whereas there are other perspectives, lower perspectives, that are not aware that they are perspectives. They treat themselves as reality. That's dangerous. So you have to really be careful and watch for how a perspective tries to lock you in. Even something like science. See, everyone kind of understands that religion will try to lock you in, but most people don't understand that science is a perspective that tries to lock you in. For example, science will lock you in and try to prevent you from studying mystical or New Age stuff, or paranormal stuff, or religion. That already should clue you in on the dangers of the scientific perspective, which is not to say you shouldn't study it. Also, as you're studying all these perspectives, try to find the good in all these perspectives. Try to steel man the perspectives. So a low quality perspective will try to straw man other perspectives, whereas it's incapable of steel manning them. Whereas a higher quality perspective is capable of steel manning all perspectives. And it's not just being selfish. You see, the steel man, straw man thing is just really selfishness. So really the distinguishing characteristic between higher and lower is selfish versus selfless. And also, the higher perspective is able to make sense of and understand the lower, but the lower is not able to make sense of and understand the higher. This is a crucial distinction. So, for example, a fundamentalist Muslim probably doesn't understand and cannot make a steel man out of Christianity. And a Christian probably can't do that with Islam. But you can find higher perspectives which actually are able to make steel men out of all the religious perspectives, and they're able to explain them and find the good aspects of them, but also be honest about the bad aspects of them. You can also find perspectives that are able to understand both religion and science, but you can also find perspectives that only understand science but can't understand religion. And you can find perspectives that understand religion but can't understand science. So the more powerful perspective is the one that can understand everything beneath it. Basically, it's more inclusive. And so you're moving towards greater inclusivity. Also, the higher perspectives are more intellectually rigorous and honest. They have more integrity, whereas the lower perspectives do not. So, for example, one of the ways you can tell that right-wing talk radio is a very low-quality perspective is because of just how little integrity it has. Very little integrity. The way they skew the facts, the way they cherry pick data, the way they distort stories, the sort of emotion they throw into it, the way they make it ideological, the way they turn it into a sort of a battle, the way they make you hate the other side. These are all signs that this is a low quality perspective, and that the people themselves speaking, they have very little intellectual integrity. Which is why you find them saying one thing one year and another thing, they're switching their positions all the time. They use double standards all the time. The standards they apply to their party, they don't apply to the other party. As soon as the other party is out of power, the standards completely change. This is what you see. And I'm not saying the left wing is immune to that. It's not. It has that, but to a much lesser degree than right-wing talk radio. That's some of the worst perspective, some of the lowest quality, lowest integrity perspectives you can find. And you might wonder at this point, well, Leo, but how do I know that what you're telling me is true? I mean, all this you said is just one more perspective. Yeah, that's right. You don't know. I'm telling you the conclusions I've come to after 20 years of doing this work. If you're new to this, then you don't know, and you're going to have to go through maybe a 10 or 20 year process to figure out and to come to conclusions that I came to, or maybe you'll come to your own different conclusions. But eventually, if you're doing this process correctly, you'll realize that what I just told you here is gold. This is gold. I'm telling you how to distinguish truth from falsehood. In the end, the biggest thing that distinguishes truth from falsehood is fear versus love. That's the easiest way. If a perspective is coming from fear, it's false. If a perspective is coming from love, it's true. Because what you'll ultimately realize is that truth is love. And then there's just many, many degrees of it. So in the end, what you discover after you go through this nihilistic phase is that you discover that the best way to live your life is to live your life like it is a work of art. Live for beauty and live for love and live for truth and live selflessly. Not because you have to, not because somebody told you to do it, but simply because love is its own reward. What do you want ultimately in your life? You want to love your life. You want love in your life. You want others who love you in your life, and you want others whom you can love in your life. That's what you ultimately want, even if you're a nihilist. And so the only thing to do is just to surrender to love and to align yourself deeper with love and to find what are the authentic ways of loving reality and life. And put your focus into that love, work towards that love with courage, ignore all the distractions and the lower consciousness stuff. And then what's going to happen is that you're going to come out of this nihilistic funk and relativity towards a life that is actually very purposeful, but it's purposeful in a sort of a higher order way, in a meta way. It's a meta purpose. It's a purpose with a capital P beyond the lower P purpose. It's your own authentic purpose. And really, your own authentic purpose is just your love for life, expressed uniquely through you, free of the distortions and corruptions of social conditioning. And that is how you deal with nihilism. All right, I'm all done here. Please click the like button for me and come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. You will find on there my book list. You will find the life purpose course that I mentioned. You will find my blog. You will find the forum. You can support me on patreon.com/actualized. You can check out my new second channel called Actualized Clips. And then really what Actualized.org is about is it's about guiding you through this nihilistic process, but in a very practical and positive way. Because truly, nihilism is the most positive of things when you do it properly. The problem is that most people don't do it properly. They get stuck. And so I sort of pioneered this process for myself from a young age, thinking about epistemology and metaphysics and philosophy very deeply, and taking it from the point where it was just philosophy to the point where you're starting to implement it in your life and using it to change your life at a practical level. And then it starts to change how you feel about yourself. You stop being a victim. You stop getting depressed. You develop a sense of meaning in your life that is authentic to you. You're honest with yourself about the meaning. You're not fooling yourself. You're not trying to rationalize it or ground it in some sort of social construct. You're freeing up your mind more. Your mind gets liberated. You're able to think more laterally, more outside the box. You're able to be more creative. You're able to be a better artist. And then from this sort of foundation, you can set up the rest of your life. And then eventually you can awaken and you can reach God realization and you can break through into infinite love. And then you can bring it back down to earth and exhibit it in your practical everyday life, which is really what the hero's journey is about. The hero is not defeating the dragon just for the sake of defeating the dragon. The hero is defeating the dragon to acquire the Holy Grail, which is literally immortality or God. The hero is realizing God, realizing love, and then bringing that Holy Grail back to his villagers and helping them to drink from the cup of infinite love in his own way. That is the hero's journey. That is what's most worthwhile to do. And that cup, that love is nothing. Perfectly consistent with true nihilism.